just in the book that I mentioned, The Crisis of Zionism, which I believe came out in 2012, in the conclusion of that book, you wrote that American Jews needed to reconcile Israel's democratic and Zionist ideals in this generation, or that the next generation would have to decide between them. That book was written about almost 10 years ago. How do you feel about the events that have transpired in the last year, and especially in the last month, as it relates to that sentence that you wrote 10 years ago?
So I think, unfortunately, the last, the events of the last 10 years, I think, have reaffirmed many of the fears that I had when I wrote that book, about the degree to which oppression of Palestinians was a permanent, had become a kind of permanent feature of the Israeli state. And so, and the degree to which the notion of partition between a Jewish and Palestinian state, so that at least Palestinians would no longer be stateless, that Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem would have their own country of which they could be citizens, has become more and more and more remote. And so I myself have had to, my views have had to evolve in response to events. And although I would still consider myself a Zionist, I would now consider myself a cultural Zionist, not a political Zionist. So that may seem obscure to some people, but there's a cultural Zionist tradition which roots to people like Achad Ha'am and then Martin Buber and Judah Magnus, who believed in the importance of a Jewish society in Israel-Palestine, of a thriving Jewish community, what you could call a Jewish home, but not a Jewish state, and believed that this Jewish society could, in fact, and should, in fact, live under a condition of equality with Palestinians. And so that is a move for me away from political Zionism, which is the idea that there should be a state that privileges Jews over Palestinians. I think that's no longer realistic, because I think partition is no longer possible. And I've also come to believe that that it doesn't address certain really important fundamental underlying questions, like the right of Palestinian refugees to return, or some of the inherent conflicts between the notion of liberal democracy and equality under the law on the one hand, and the notion of a state that has an ethno-religious character on the other.